No two guts are the same. I often hear people say, well, what diet are you following? Oh, well, I follow it, but it doesn't work very well for me. Well, it works for me. Right, that's how it is. Just because someone follows a diet doesn't mean they'll see the same beneficial effects as their neighbor or sister, okay? Because no two guts are the same. And look, to start with, the gut has its own neurons. It doesn't use them to think, but it does use them for everything related to the enteric plexus, all its movement, etc., and so on, its endocrine regulation and so on. Well, notice that the microorganisms in the gut weigh about 200 grams in total. Imagine this. It's said that if the bacteria and microorganisms from the gut were to come out through the belly button, they would line up all the way to the moon. It also produces many nutrients for the brain, so the genome, that is the genetic representation of all that gut flora, is much larger than the genetic representation of our own human cells, up to 150 times greater. Imagine this. We are colonized by a bunch of microorganisms that aren't great allies for having a healthy brain. Well, enterotypes, that is, the type of microbial profile that each person has in their gut, vary from one person to another. And here you have, well, this is just a simple example. There are different groups, large groups like Bacteroidetes, Proteobacteria, etc., etc. And each person, starting from around 3 to 4 years old, already has, let's say, their own enterotype, which would be like a kind of blood type. And I always say that this enterotype depends more on the postal code than on the genetic code. In other words, you can have gut flora that's much more similar to someone who lives in your environment, for example, if you live in a rural area around animals, than to your sister who might live in a city compared to you. It also depends a lot on your lifestyle. There are changes throughout life. And what's important to understand is that imbalances in those stable microbial profiles in each person can affect how the brain functions. So it's good to know what some of those factors are that cause imbalances. Gut flora. Why? Because it's currently known that some common neuropathologies in humans are associated with problems in the gut microbiota, that is, with alterations in the enterotypes of each person. For example, one item on the list we have here, and the list is growing, is Parkinson's. In fact, Parkinson's often shows significant intestinal dysfunctions for up to 6 or 7 years before the first neuropathological symptoms appear, along with depression, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, autism, anxiety, Alzheimer's, schizophrenia, insomnia, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and its variations. In other words, there is a strong connection between altered states of our gut microbiota and factors or parameters that influence these neuropathologies. So taking care of our gut is also a fundamental task for taking care of our brain. So how can we currently, what is being proposed from the clinic, to correct those potential dysbioses that might be developing? Well, fundamentally, there are prebiotics, which are the foods themselves. They aren't bacteria, but they are the food for the bacteria, meaning those foods that help us improve and enrich our gut flora. Then, of course, there are probiotics, or symbiotics, which is the combination of prebiotics and probiotics. Probiotics are live bacteria that get added to our gut flora. But it's pointless to consume probiotics if we don't also make changes to our diet that allow us to feed them. In other words, a probiotic should also be accompanied by the right diet so that those bacteria can thrive properly in our intestines. Sometimes antibiotics are used, but there isn't just any antibiotic for the flu or something like that. No. Here, the antibiotics would be specific to a particular profile. When there's an excess of a specific bacteria that's causing an imbalance, then you can reduce the population of that particular bacteria to restore the gut balance. And finally, even though it might sound a bit gross, fecal transplants. What are transplants aiming for? Well, fecal transplants basically involve inoculating fecal matter, specifically all the living material from the stool of a healthy person, into someone who has an intestinal imbalance. What is done in practice? Well, in feces, about 40 to 50% is living matter, meaning it's the gut microbiota of that person. So what's being attempted is, without specifying a particular type of bacteria, to create a microenvironment in the sick person with that transplant. Okay, it has been done, and in some specific cases, there have been studies on autism. And well, clearly there's still a lot to learn about that, particularly because not everyone can be a donor. And on the other hand, as I mentioned before, each intestine is unique. But yes, fecal transplants can help create a change in the microbial context of that imbalanced intestine, and often an improvement in the neuropathology being addressed is also observed.